On a sweltering summer afternoon in northern France, a battle erupted that would shape the fate of Europe. The Battle of Bouvines, fought on the 27th of July 1214, was more than a military confrontation. It was a dramatic turning point. In a spectacle of chivalry and chaos, King Philippe II of France, aptly named Augustus, fought against a formidable coalition led by Emperor Otto IV of the Holy Roman Empire, including the half-brother of King John of England and some rebellious French nobles. The stakes? Nothing less than the survival of the Capetian dynasty and the shape of medieval Europe itself. The early 13th century was a time of chaos and power struggles. King John of England was desperate to regain his lost French lands. To this end, John allied with the Holy Roman Emperor Otto IV, the Count of Flanders, and others, hoping that this grand coalition would crush King Philippe II of France. For decades, since the rise of the Plantagenets under Henry II, the kings of England controlled more of France than the French king himself. This Angevin Empire stretched from Scotland to the Pyrenees and included Normandy and Anjou, as well as the jewel of the domain, Aquitaine. For King Philippe, on his ascension in 1180, this obviously presented a direct threat to his kingship. Yet Philippe, later dubbed Augustus by his supporters, was no ordinary monarch. He was a cunning strategist and a master of medieval statecraft. By skillfully weaving a network of agreements and alliances, he exploited divisions within the English royal family, particularly between Henry II and his sons, and most notably Richard the Lionheart and John. In 1189, Philippe allied with Richard against Henry II, helping him rebel against his father, and all but driving Henry to a premature end. Afterwards, Philippe and Richard joined the Third Crusade, where relations between the two kings soured. However, Philippe remained one step ahead in the political game. In late 1192, when Richard was captured in Germany and held for ransom, Philippe took advantage of his absence to seize lands in Normandy. Richard was later able to recover some of these territories, but upon his death in 1199, his younger brother John succeeded as King of England. King John had none of the political nous of his father, nor the military talent of his brother. While Richard's potential successor, Philippe had found it convenient to stoke John's ambitions, with the two conspiring to keep Richard languishing in captivity. However, now that John was at the Angevin helm, he became the problem. Philippe was fortunate in his opponent. John had a track record of rubbing his allies up the wrong way. His reign would be notorious for his abuses and high taxation, while his treatment of his barons left much to be desired. The new Angevin king was immediately challenged by Philippe for the right to rule his French lands. Firstly, the French king supported Arthur of Brittany, John's nephew and rival, given he was arguably the rightful heir to the throne of England. This undermined John's control over his French territories. Secondly, Philippe used his position as feudal overlord of John to enable his seizure of his French lands. In 1202, he summoned John to Paris over a marriage dispute. John had refused on account of a prior agreement that as Duke of Normandy he was not required to physically attend. However, Philippe simply retorted that his summons was not for the Duke of Normandy, but to the Duke of Aquitaine and Count of Anjou, officers who had no such immunity. Having ignored the summons, Philippe took this chance to pounce. He declared John's French territories forfeit as a disobedient vassal and attacked Normandy's border region. The following immediate period of hostilities, however, was a triumph for John. With Philippe having sent Arthur of Brittany south to support John's Lusignan opponents, John sped south to relieve his besieged mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine, with the subsequent Battle of Mirabeau securing both Hugh de Lusignan and, more importantly, his nephew, Duke Arthur, as captives. Despite this success, the tide of history was with King Philippe. By 1204, Philippe had seized most of John's lands, including Normandy, Anjou, Maine, Touraine, and had drawn Brittany back into the French sphere of influence. By taking these territories of the Angevin Empire, Philippe severely reduced English influence in France, while dramatically increasing the territories under his direct control. This, in turn, unlocked immense funds and manpower, which he used to strengthen his kingdom. Unlike his predecessors, Philippe hired more mercenary and professional warriors. These could be fielded longer than feudal levies who served set periods. Brabançons and other routiers, or professional fighters, were widely used. To support a paid army, he reformed the royal administration to increase tax income, introduced extraordinary taxes in times of war, and used income from royal domains. In addition, the king's encouragement of the founding of communes or self-governed towns also yielded military support in return for privileges. He also improved military logistics and organization by developing systems for provisioning troops and transporting them across long distances. His administration ensured better coordination during campaigns, which increased the overall effectiveness of his forces. Finally, Philippe cleverly used crusades. Besides participating in the Third Crusade, Philippe later endorsed the Albigensian Crusade. These crusading efforts allowed him to raise large armies under religious sanction and to strengthen his political control under the guise of holy war. Philippe's military campaigns continued southward into Poitou and then into Aquitaine, the prized English possession. He supported rebellion in the region against John and occupied towns loyal to the French crown. However, in 1206, John did launch his own expedition in the south to counter this encroachment. Landing in La Rochelle, John set about re-establishing his authority over Gascony and other areas. Much of the former had been assailed by King Alfonso of Castile, who claimed the region by right of his wife. However, having failed to take Bordeaux, he had withdrawn. Yet, though successful in stabilizing the south, John failed to regain his other ancestral lands. By 1208, only Aquitaine proper, centered around Gascony, remained in English hands, but was becoming increasingly isolated and difficult to govern. Yet Philippe's successes also alarmed the Holy Roman Emperor Otto IV, nephew of John. Both men feared the growing power of Capetian France. Otto therefore agreed to aid in John's reconquest of his lands. One advantage Philippe had over both men was their status as excommunicates. John had refused to bend to Pope Innocent III by allowing his man the important position of Archbishop of Canterbury, while Otto was cast from the bosom of the Church for reneging on his promise not to meddle in southern Italy. This proved fortuitous to Philippe, as now both enemy rulers faced severe internal crises because of this. In a stab at Otto, Philippe sided with the Pope in his support of rival Frederick II for the imperial throne, whilst eagerly denouncing King John as the enemy of the Church. In 1213, Philippe even decided to take the fight to John's kingdom for a change by assembling a fleet to invade. However, though Philippe had played the papal card well by carefully cultivating papal support, John too could play this game. In May, John swore fealty to Innocent's representative in Dover, formally making England a vassal state under the papacy. Philippe, predictably enraged, moved instead to attack Flanders, who had declined support for his expedition. John sent his half-brother, the Earl of Salisbury, with his fleet to support his allies and to set the seal on the ruined plans of French invasion by burning the largely unguarded French ships anchored at Damas. With Philippe's invasion plans stalled, John could retake the initiative. However, he knew he stood a better chance of regaining his continental possessions with allies. He therefore allied with Otto IV, who enthusiastically wished to strike at Philippe and bolster his own prestige with a victory. The Counts of Flanders, Holland and Boulogne, as well as the Dukes of Brabant and Lorraine, also sided with John, all of whom were hostile to Philippe's centralizing policies. In the south, Peter II of Aragon also joined the alliance. The coalition planned a two-front attack. King John would land in western France to regain Poitou and distract French forces, while Otto IV and his northern allies would invade France from the northeast to strike for Paris. Meanwhile, Peter II of Aragon had led a campaign into southern France against Simon de Montfort, a French noble conducting the Albigensian Crusade under papal blessing. Though not directly coordinated with the Northern Alliance, Peter's encroachment created additional pressure on Philippe II's resources. John sailed from England in February of 1214, landing after a slight delay in La Rochelle. He spent a couple of weeks in the area, reminding the local lords of their loyalties, before moving through his wife's domain of Angoulême and then into Limousin. At La Souterraine, at the border with Philippe's domain, John received the homage of the Count of Périgord, before, 4 days later, entering the city of Limoges and receiving Viscount Guy's submission. Philippe, however, was not idle in his response. Mustering his own army, he set out south to confront his errant vassal. By April, he was at Châteauroux. Feeling he had accomplished his task of distraction, John withdrew the way he came, heading to Gascony to impose his authority there. This too came to little. Reaching La Réole, he faced the far more aggressive de Montfort, whose attack prompted John's withdrawal back to La Rochelle. However, with Philippe and the main French force absent, and having his army swelled with reconciled Lusignan manpower, John had eventually found himself besieging the castle of La Roche-aux-Moines near Angers, his family's ancestral seat. Seeking assistance, the defenders sought Prince Louis, later known as the Lion, who moved to confront John's much larger army. John had every reason to deploy for battle, given his superiority in numbers. However, his newly won Lusignan allies made their excuses and refused their aid in any pitched battle. Abandoned by his allies, John's confidence vanished, and he beat a hasty retreat south. Unfortunately for his baggage, valuables, and slower-moving infantry, he had few scruples in placing as much space between himself and Prince Louis as possible. Yet while he rode way clear of danger, many of his abandoned men were slain or drowned in the Loire, while his siege engines, clothes, pavilions, and money were also seized by the vengeful garrison of La Roche-aux-Moines. It was an inglorious end to John's campaign. Meanwhile, in the north, the other part of the coalition lingered, awaiting the arrival of Emperor Otto. John's brother, the Earl of Salisbury, had joined the Allies there. With tales of their depredations reaching Philippe in Châteauroux, the French king made the momentous decision to divide his forces. Leaving his son and heir Louis to oppose John in the south, he led most of his forces back north to confront the enemy there, mustering in Péronne. Count Ferrand of Flanders, Salisbury and the other lords awaited Otto at Valenciennes. For the French under Philippe, Flanders was guarded by the Somme and Scheldt rivers, with their marshy terrain between them. Philippe marched his army via the bridge at Bouvines across the Marque. This was a decent route to the Scheldt crossing in the friendly town of Tournai. From there he sought to enter Flanders and take the fight to his enemies. However, it was in Tournai that his plans changed. Otto's spies had informed him of Philippe's position and had moved north to contain the French in the city. Philippe in turn decided that a feigned retreat could lure the coalition into more open terrain away from the marshes, and so evacuated Tournai to head for Lille. For Otto and the other leaders of the Allied army, this confirmed that the French had no stomach for the fight, with only Reginald of Boulogne protesting that it was not the habit of the French to flee. Otto, however, ordered a pursuit, hoping to intercept Philippe's army before it could recross the Marque. Meanwhile, Philippe had begun the crossing, ensuring the safety of the baggage and ordering most of his infantry across, while he and the rest remained on the east bank. Unfortunately for Philippe, his enemies had been swifter, and now they began to engage his rear guard from the hamlet of Cizouan to the southeast. From Otto's perspective, the French were in a shameful retreat, and now was the time to strike. As the main Allied body was forming, the Viscount of Melun was being heavily pressed, with assistance of the heavy horse of the Duke of Burgundy stabilizing things. Philippe at this time had been resting under an ash tree when this news reached him, causing a near panic amongst his followers. However, the French monarch calmly stepped into the nearby chapel to offer up his own prayers before arming himself for the inevitable clash to come. Philippe knew that his full army would never make it across before the Allies struck. To abandon his rearguard to their destruction would be an unambiguous defeat. Philippe ordered the infantry to rejoin him. He would roll the dice and face the larger coalition army. To call this decision risky is an understatement. If Philippe were to be captured or worse, killed, then with him would die the prospect of a powerful French kingdom. For the victors would surely carve up the lands between them and perhaps herald a new Angevin dominion. Indeed, Otto has been criticized for his hesitation at this time. Had he brought down the full weight of his numbers while the French recrossed, he would likely have won the day. Alas for the Emperor, he balked at the chance. Otto's intelligence was poor, and he was shocked at the French numbers, and that, far from retreating, they now moved to face him in the field. Arguably the hero of the hour, the Duke of Burgundy had delayed the Allies long enough to allow his comrades a fighting chance. He rejoined the 3 battles or divisions arrayed against the coalition, taking his place on the right, alongside the Count of Champagne and other lords. Philippe himself took position in the French centre, conspicuous by the flying overhead of the Oriflamme banner that signalled no mercy would be given to his enemies. Surrounded by his retinue and knights, the bulk of his division consisted of crossbowmen and infantry from the French communes, who deployed forward. Finally, the French left was led by the Bishop of Beauvais, alongside the Counts of Auxerre, Dreux and Ponthieu. Similarly to the right, this battle consisted of knights to the front and infantry behind. While precise numbers are unknown, it's clear the Allied army outnumbered the French. Facing Burgundy's division were the knights and infantry of the Flemings and Hainaulters, under Count Ferrand of Flanders. The men of the Flemish towns comprised the infantry mass in the centre, with the heavy cavalry and infantry of the Duke of Brabant, and, of course, Emperor Otto himself, with his retinue and knights supporting them. Above Otto flew an equally ominous banner depicting a golden eagle upon a dragon. At the right were positioned the English knights under the Earl of Salisbury, as well as Brabanter infantry. These adopted a defensive circuit around the smaller retinue of knights under the command of the Count of Bologna. This would, in theory, enable the Count's cavalry to strike at the foe, whilst enabling them to retreat into the safety of the ring. Around 1:30 in the afternoon, the battle opened with the attack of some light cavalry from the French right. As these were warriors of lesser status, it seems the Flemish knights opposite had little interest in engaging them. The Soissons nevertheless engaged the Allied left. However, many were unceremoniously unhorsed and dispatched. The Flemish knights, with a far more tempting quarry in mind, sent a contingent to assault Philippe's division. Ferrand, the Count of Flanders, had sworn the same oath as all his fellow commanders that he would only seek to engage the king. Their strategy was to capture or kill Philippe, which would likely bring about his army's collapse. The Flemings didn't get the chance, however, as meeting them were the Knights of Champagne. Clashing in the no-man's land, this massed carnage of man and beast at first resembled a dignified image of the heroic knight, with lances couched but quickly shattered and rapidly devolving into a bloody brawl. Opposing warriors quickly looked to unseat their foes, drawing their swords and even daggers, with the aim of stabbing at the vulnerable points in an enemy's armor. In addition, the great heat too must have accelerated the exhaustion of all but the hardiest of men. Meanwhile, having contacted the French centre around the same time, the better quality Flemish pikemen cracked the resolve of the urban infantry in front of Philip. This left the French monarch dangerously exposed, with Philippe even being unhorsed and struck, though his armour deflected the blow. Rallying to the aid of their king, the French knights counterattacked with reckless rage. This shocked the jubilant pikemen, who in turn were pushed back. The engagement on the right had ground on, however, charging in successive waves. The Count of St. Pol, then the Duke of Burgundy, and finally the Viscount of Milan smashed through the Flemish, whilst also focusing on the flanks. Burgundy, like Philippe, had a particularly hairy moment when his horse had been killed underneath him. However, no worse for wear, he remounted and charged anew to avenge this indignity. Throughout this contest, the fighting had been necessarily staggered given the sheer physical strain and the heat of the day. Yet despite their efforts, it would be the Allied knights who blinked first. The breakthrough came when Ferrand himself was felled, wounded and taken alive. Ironically, their aim of beheading the French army was visited on them, for with Ferrand's exit, the Allied knights began to scatter. Things had also taken the same ill turn in the centre for Otto. Now it was his person under direct threat as the French cut their way ever closer. One of Otto's entourage urged him to flee, but for the moment he stood firm. This almost cost the Emperor his life. A French knight struck a blow, only finding steel, not flesh, but his second blow found Otto's horse. This stinging strike spurred the poor beast to flee, along with its master. At the sight of his counterpart's back, Philippe declared his flight. In fact, Otto's horse collapsed under him, and he was almost seized by a pursuing French knight. Capture was not to be Otto's fate, however, and given a fresh mount, he cleared the fighting, while his Saxon knights held off the French. The Germans stood for a time against Philippe's onslaught, but with their monarch gone, they too began to trickle away, before their battle gave way to collapse. The victorious French knights advanced to the abandoned imperial chariot and hacked down the Great Eagle on Dragon Banner. During all of this, the Allied right under the Count of Bologna and Earl of Salisbury had also geared their efforts towards Philippe and his battle, though these charges had been checked by the ignored French left. Salisbury had had some success in pushing the cavalry under Philippe of Dreux back to threaten the bridge, but the situation was remedied for the French by the Bishop of Beauvais. Salisbury had been captured earlier on, and the Count of Bologna was also taken after his horse was killed by a dismounted sergeant and had trapped his leg. To their credit, the men comprising the infantry circle held their ground. However, with the rest of their comrades killed, captured, or fled, theirs was a forlorn struggle. 2,000 French foot, led by some knights, streamed around them and overwhelmed this final bastion of resistance. Pursuit was not seriously undertaken, as by battle's end the darkness was already creeping in. Philippe was also concerned that vigorous pursuit would leave the prisoners already taken free to escape. Philippe returned to a hero's welcome in Paris, with the chained Count Ferrand, among other captives, in his wake. As for the ill-starred Otto, he was soon overthrown in favour of Frederick II, the French-backed claimant in the south, becoming the sole member of the short-lived Welf imperial dynasty. The Battle of Bouvines was an engagement just as important for the French as Hastings was for the English. It was a key moment of nation-building that ensured the existence of the growing centralised French kingdom. Direct control over much of France was maintained, and now King John had little hope of restoring the Angevin Empire, with English control reduced to Gascony. John would return to a rebellious realm, his barons tired of his overbearing behaviour and taxation, to the point of eventually requiring him to endorse Magna Carta, the Great Charter. This heavily restricted his actions, guaranteed certain rights, such as the right to be tried by one's peers and not to be arbitrarily arrested or held. It also established the principle that the king was not above the law. The document also remains a foundation of the English constitution and parliamentary system to this day, arguably another direct legacy of this titanic battle of medieval history. If you like what you see, consider supporting my work on Patreon, and you get ad-free early access to my videos for as little as $1. You can also show your support by liking the video, commenting, and subscribing to my channel as a sacrifice to the algorithm. As always, I'll see you in the next one.